200 years ago, the West was America's frontier, and mining its resources was America's future. Mining, as opposed to harvesting, meant digging up, chopping down, or otherwise removing things that either could not be replaced at all, or that could not be replaced fast enough to keep up with our rate of removal. When the resources were gone, the people were gone too, leaving behind only shadows of things that were no more, empty towns, and phantom trees, or gold, or buffalo. The Sun Belt is our frontier now, and coping with 70 times as many Americans as we had 200 years ago, who all want to live the good life in a warm place, has become America's future. To build the homes and stores and roads which that future implies, we're still mining. But we're not only mining rocks or trees or animals this time, we're mining water. Over the past 2 centuries, America, and much of the rest of the world, has learned to do some things differently. We now know that even so-called renewable resources aren't renewable if too many people use too much of them too quickly. Here in Florida, though, we're still acting as if technology, or magic, will somehow make it possible for us to keep on building houses and bringing in people forever, as if our growth industry is not dependent on one of the most basic needs of all, water.
Even though every rural county I know would like to keep their quality of life, every one of them is more concerned about keeping their kids at home and making sure they have opportunities for employment, and that generally only happens with increased population. So we have a growth model that's only success is by adding people. The downside has been in 2 areas.
Wayne Daltrey was executive director of the Southwest Florida Regional Planning Council for 20 years, and recently received the Florida Planning Association's highest award for lifetime achievement.
The Water Resources Act basically called for planning with understanding of a baseline. Unfortunately, a large part of that was never really completed. In fact, even now, we do not have minimum flows and levels established for many of Florida's water bodies. This is basically 26 years after the water management districts were given a statewide coverage and about 30 years after the Water Resources Act. So what happened was permits by individually could be certified as causing no harm, but collectively we've ended up with the problem. Aquifer levels continue to decline, basically statewide, where there's any large development, which is the southern and central part of the state.
Florida gets more rainfall than almost any other state, yet 2/3 of our rain evaporates almost immediately or runs off into the ocean. Life here depends on huge reservoirs of underground water known as aquifers. Our booming population already makes enormous demands on that resource. Yet the people who manage our water issue permits to almost everybody who wants one, without comprehensively defining just how much water we have or how much can be withdrawn without causing permanent damage.
The Floridan aquifer is capable of providing something like 400,000 cubic feet per second is the total flow rate. And overall, the Southwest Florida Water Management District is allowing the withdrawal of something like 700,000 cubic feet per second. And sooner or later, Mother Nature is going to force you to straighten out that balance.
Balance, or sustainability, is a matter of numbers. As overwhelming as residential development is, agriculture and industry make their own demands. And often, the needs of one group conflict with the needs of another. Nobody knows this better than Charlotte County Commissioner Adam Cummings.
Anything that affects the freshwater inflows into Charlotte Harbor is of immense consequence to our quality of life and our local economy. The proposals that they have now for continuing strip mining for phosphate in the Peace River Basin, I believe will have enormous consequences if we don't change the course that we're on. They have been mining for phosphate in the basin for over 100 years, but it continues over time to be of ever and ever greater scale. There's an element of strip mining that is inherently destructive, no matter how well-intentioned or how hard you try to do a good job of reclamation. We're taking those active steps to move us toward sustainability and a high quality of life in the future. We want the same thing from the phosphate industry.
Sustainability is hard to accomplish when Florida's population keeps growing almost twice as fast as the rest of the U.S., and when we're already overpumping our aquifers. Jim Stevenson is chair of the state's Florida Springs Task Force.
We have more blue water springs in North Florida than any other place in the world. But although some of those springs are healthy, a number are sick and even more are dying. There are a number of springs where we have been checking the discharge for several years, and we can note the reduced flow over time. For instance, Sulphur Springs in downtown Tampa. When the city of Tampa turns on their pump to supplement the city's water supply, the spring virtually stops flowing until the pump is turned off. Kissingen Spring was once a popular recreation area for perhaps 100 years, but in 1950 it stopped flowing completely and has never flowed since because of pumping in its recharge area. We have hundreds of people moving into Florida every day that think they've moved to paradise and don't really understand that it is almost paradise lost.
Declines in aquifer pressure also seem to be showing up as an increase in the number of sinkholes, which are collapses of surface rocks in places where the underground water pressure is no longer enough to support them. We can only guess at this now because the state, which started keeping track of sinkholes in 1982, dropped its monitoring program 10 years later in another apparent move to minimize environmental objections to continued growth. Instead of recognizing our natural limits and trying to live within them, wishful thinkers and politicians offer technological band-aids like desalination, which introduce new kinds of environmental problems, like more energy consumption and toxic wastes. These so-called solutions could take some of the pressure off our aquifers, but they would double or triple our water bills and provide another excuse for continued growth. When it comes to growth, our state and local governments have a poor record of taking the needs of our existing human population into account. But they have an even worse record of considering populations who have been living here much longer than people.
Manatees have been part of the ecosystem here in Florida as part of the New World for over 1 million years. Their ancestors, the Sirenia, other forms of Sirenia, have actually been around 45 million years. So they're a very ancient species that has evolved in the system, has come to use the estuarine and freshwater areas of coastal Florida. There is a program underway right now where the St. Johns River Water Management District is working on trying to establish a minimum flow. The flow rate being discussed presently would allow more than a 20% reduction in the historic flow rate before any limit would be put on that. And that would create great reductions in the amount of refuge area available for manatees.